Good morning, students. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss about classification of proteins. Proteins are classified into the on the basis of their solubility and shape and on the basis of their chemical composition. In today's lecture, we will discuss the classification of proteins in the two ways. Next, see here the classification of proteins on the basis of their shape and solubility. On the basis of their shape and solubility, proteins are classified into the two classes. One is the globular proteins and other is the fibrous proteins. See one by one. Globular proteins is spherical in a shape, soluble in water, dilute acids, alkalis and salts. These are highly branched proteins, non-contractile. The polypeptide chains are compactly folded to form globular or spherical shaped proteins. In this globular protein, the polypeptide chains are cross-linked by usual polypeptide bonds involving second amino groups of one amino acid and second carboxylic group of second amino acids. In this polypeptide chain may also be tightly folded into spherical or globular shapes. The most well-known example of globular proteins is egg albumin, serum albumin, all enzymes, antibodies, hemoglobin and myoglobin. Next, the fibrous protein. Fibrous proteins are in the form of fibers. These are insoluble in water but soluble in concentrated acids or alkalis. These proteins are unbranched and these are contractile. The fibrous proteins, in this fibrous protein, the polypeptide chains are extended along one axis and spirally wounded to form fibers. They are linear molecules. The long linear protein chains are held together by intermolecular hydrogen bonds. They serve as a structural proteins. The most common example of fibrous protein is that alpha keratin of hair, nails, claves, horns, feathers, and the proteins of skeletal muscle such as the actin and myosin, fibrils of silk, and so on. Then next, see this the structure of the fibrous protein and globular protein. This is the structure of fibrous protein and this is the structure of globular protein. Fibrous proteins are look like the fibers and globular proteins are look like a spherical shape. Then next classification on the basis of chemical composition. On the basis of chemical composition, proteins are classified into the three classes, three groups: simple proteins, conjugated proteins and derived proteins. Simple proteins are also called as hollow proteins. These are formed of only amino acids and their derivatives. The most well-known example is albumin, globulin, glutein, prolamins, histones, globins and protamines. And also the simple proteins are scleroproteins and also called as albuminoid. In the scleroproteins, the examples are collagens of tendons, elastins, keratins of hair, nails and so on. This classification on the basis of their solubility. So, see the one by one in detail. In the globular protein, albumins are simple proteins and soluble in water. They are precipitated by saturated ammonium sulfate salt solutions. The example of the albumin proteins is plasma albumin, serum albumin and so on. Then next, globulins. Globulins are also simple proteins. They are insoluble in water but soluble in a dilute solutions of neutral salt. The example of these globulins are plasma globulins, serum globulin myosin in muscles, and so on. Then next, prolamines. Prolamines are also simple protein. They are soluble in 70 to 80% of ethyl alcohol, but they are insoluble in water, absolute alcohol, and other neutral solvent. Next, histones. Histones are the also simple proteins soluble in water and dilute acids, but insoluble in ammonia. The example of the histone protein is that histidine, arginine, and so on. Then next, protamines. Protamines are simple proteins. They are soluble in water, ammonium and ammonium hydroxide. They contains large quantity of arginine. Next, celluloproteins are also called as albuminoids. The celluloproteins includes collagens in tendons, elastin in ligaments, fibrinogens in silk, keratin in hair, nails, and so on. This is about the classification of proteins on the basis of chemical composition. That the simple proteins are subclassified into these 7 classes, and simple proteins are made up of only amino acids and their derivatives. This is about the simple protein. Then next, conjugated protein. These conjugated proteins are also called as heteroproteins. These are associated with inorganic and organic prosthetic groups. These proteins is associated with non-proteinous part known as a prosthetic group, that is which is important for protein functions. They are classified into the 5 subtypes. Six subtypes: nucleoproteins, glycoproteins, also called as mucoproteins, lipoproteins, phosphoproteins, chromoproteins, and metalloproteins. See one by one and their examples. First, see one by one. Nucleoproteins. In this, they contain nucleic acid as a prosthetic group. For example, nuclein, nucleohistones, and so on. Then next, glycoproteins, also called as mucoproteins. Glycoproteins, in this, they contain carbohydrate as a prosthetic groups. For example, mucin in saliva, egg albumin, serum albumin, and so on. Then next, lipoproteins. Lipoproteins, they contain phospholipids or cholesterol as the prosthetic group. For example, lipoproteins of blood serum. Next, phosphoproteins. Phosphoproteins, they contains phosphoric acid as a prosthetic group, and phosphoric acid is attached to hydroxy group of proteins by an ester linkage. For example, most well-known example is the casein in a milk, vitelline in a egg yolk, and so on. Then next, chromoproteins. Chromo means color, that is, these are the colored proteins. In this, they are linked to metallic prosthetic groups, which gives the color to the proteins. The example of the chromoproteins is that hemoglobin, hemocyanin, cytochromes, chlorophyll, and so on. Next, metalloproteins. In this, they contains metals. These are the metalloproteins. Then next, in this conjugated proteins, we will see that conjugated proteins are associated with inorganic and organic prosthetic groups, and in this, these are the 6 types of the conjugated proteins depending on their prosthetic groups. That is, nucleoproteins contains nucleic acid as a prosthetic group. Glycoproteins contains carbohydrate as a prosthetic group. Lipoprotein contains phospholipids or cholesterol as a prosthetic group. Phosphoproteins contains phosphoric acid as a prosthetic group. Chromoprotein contains a metallic prosthetic group which gives the color to the protein, that these are the colored protein. And metalloprotein contains metals in this proteins. This is about the conjugated proteins or heteroproteins. Then next derived protein. Derived proteins are intermediate product formed from natural proteins when they are hydrolyzed. Their derived proteins are of the two types, primary proteins and secondary proteins. These derived proteins are when proteins are hydrolyzed or denatured by acids, alkalis or enzymes. The degradation product obtained from them are called derived protein. Simply, when protein is heated, it is denatured also by certain chemical reactions are broke down and resulting into the small size polypeptide. These small size molecules are derived from. Derived proteins are classified into these two classes, that is primary proteins and secondary proteins. Primary proteins are the derivatives of protein in which the size of protein molecule is not materially altered. They are of three types: coagulated proteins, proteins, and metaproteins. And next, secondary proteins. Secondary proteins are the product of proteins in which definite hydrolysis has taken place. They are of mainly three types. Here four types: proteases, peptones, polypeptides and peptides. Then next, this is about the classification of proteins. In the classification, we will see the classification on the basis of their shape and solubility and on the basis of their chemical composition. See the summary of this today's lecture, that is classification on the basis of solubility. Proteins are classified into the globular proteins and fibrous proteins. Globular proteins are spherical in shape, autosoluble, also soluble in dilute acids, alkalis and salts, highly branched, non-contractile. These are the polypeptide chains are compactly folded to form the globular or spherical shaped proteins. Examples are egg albumin, serum albumin, and all enzymes, hemoglobin, myoglobin. Then fibrous proteins, these are in the form of fibers, water insoluble, soluble in concentrated acids or alkalis. These are unbranched, contractile. The polypeptide chains are extended along one axis, spirally wounded to form fibers. The well-known example is alpha keratin of hair, nails, clays, and so on. This is the structure of this globular protein and fibrous protein. Then next, classification on the basis of their composition. Their proteins are classified into the simple. These are simply made up of only amino acids and derivatives. Next, conjugated, also called as a heteroproteins. These are associated with inorganic and organic prosthetic groups. And next, in the last, derived proteins. Derived proteins are hydrolyzed. Proteins are hydrolyzed or denatured by acids and alkalis or enzymes. The degradation product obtained from them are called derived proteins. And these are the subclasses of these three proteins.